Hey, everybody, it's Scott Leckie from Democracy Tomorrow with our European correspondent, Matthias von Hein, to update us on some of the major developments in Europe over the last couple of weeks. There's been some major ones, well, in every region of the world, but particularly in Europe. So, Matthias, welcome back to Democracy Tomorrow. What's going on in Europa these days?
Well, I mean, a lot of happened, as you said in the introduction, since we talked last. And I think one of the major events happening in Europe was the NATO summit at the end of June. When it comes to relevance and long-term effects. At this, 2-day meeting, which was condensed very much so as to fit Donald Trump's, likes and dislikes. He got a great reception. He did spend time in the palace of the Dutch king and queen, and a lot of pomp. And the NATO General Secretary, even before the summit, sort of in a way that actually, as a European, I feel is embarrassing. He crept up, to Donald Trump, with a very super deferential, message that Trump even published, on social media, in which he praised Trump, for enabling, all that, and he's basically saying he's the best and the biggest and the greatest, and the Europeans kind of deserve to be treated like he treated them and treats them in order to get them, to do what basically Trump wants them to do, which is raising their military expenditure by, fabulous amounts, in my eyes, totally overblown. So what this NATO summit came up with was the plan to raise expenditure for the military to 5% of GDP, which is, doubling or sometimes tripling the amount that is spent today. This is not happening tomorrow, but over the next 10 years. All of this is, the argument is that, Europe does need to do more. There's an unfair distribution of, costs when it comes to NATO, which is, there is, a grain of truth in there. The argument is also that, Europe needs to invest more in its military because of Russia, and because Russia is, the number one enemy and it's a grave threat. And, of course, I'm not naive, and I don't think the Europeans should be naive. But and Russia is dangerous; it's not to be trusted. But even just to give you the figures, so yeah, Russia is dangerous. But the rhetoric, that we heard, even in the months already, coming up to the NATO summit, was that Europe basically by itself is helpless. And that's not true, And if it was true, then the huge sums of money that Europeans already spent on defense is totally misspent. Because, the Europeans spend about, roughly 4 times, just the Europeans, the European part of NATO spends almost 4 times as much on defense as Russia does. And even if you account like purchase power parity and so on, even if you adjust that very generously, it's, double the amount that Russia spends on defense. So there is already, a huge bill. And when we look at the economy, so the Russian economy is more or less the size of Italy's. The European Union's economy, even without Great Britain, is 8 times as big. There's 3 times, 3 times the population. So, Europe is not helpless. And, I'm all for more sort of strategic autonomy for Europe, but the way things are going now, I don't see that coming, because a lot of the money that the Europeans are going to spend on military gear is spent buying American products. Actually, right now, every third euro that Europe is spending on defense, on defense procurement, that is going to American companies. So that's a huge business. So I mean, Donald Trump was super happy, and yeah. So that, I think, is a very major development, and because we are upping the defense spending, and at the same time a lot of European countries have to consolidate their spending. So there is no other way than to cut down on, you name it, it can be education, infrastructure, whatever, social spending, social housing. And that's why at least Spain, Pedro Sanchez from Spain, the prime minister, he said, okay, I'm going to vote with you guys, but, in Spain, we are not going to follow through because we can't afford that. And we don't think it's really necessary. But sort of in order to keep Donald Trump happy, as a hegemon, who everybody is afraid of, because everybody knows that he's a narcissist and he has mood swings that are feared far and wide. So they're trying everything to sort of placate him, so Pedro Sanchez said, okay, I vote yes, but no, we are not going to follow through because it's too expensive, it's not necessary, and I am not willing to cut into the social welfare net. We're not going to do that. So I really don't know how that's going to turn out, but I think that's one of the major developments here in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a huge issue, and the social and economic consequences of reorienting national budgets in Europe is going to be devastating for certain sectors in society, and there's no way about it, and no two ways about it. In particular, the international humanitarian spending and international development spending, for which Europe has always been the world leader and always been, the go-to governments when funds were needed to, stop a war or rebuild a country or, help slum dwellers or help women in developing countries. The list goes on. Those budgets are being slashed right and left, following the lead of the decimation of USAID by the United States, which is already directly resulting in hundreds of thousands of deaths. A direct line can be drawn between cutting that budget and people dying. And there was a recent report that just came out I think it was by the Lancet, that indicated that a minimum of 14 million people are going to die as a direct consequence of the decimation of USAID. And unfortunately, other aid agencies are already getting their budgets slashed. NATO budgeting comes along and goes up by percentage points, and they'll have to cut even more. And that's just one sector. And so the consequences of this are going to be huge. And let's not forget the fact that throughout history, whenever there's been an arms race, whenever there's been an effort between different countries to have a bigger military than their so-called enemies, it never ends well. And this is what it's as if all the political leadership in the world right now has forgotten all of the lessons of history. Every single lesson of history is there for all to see, and it's as if they're ostriches putting their head in the ground and saying, "Oh, not this time. This time it's different." Well, I'm pretty afraid that it's not different.
So am I, and I think um, you know, talking about arms race, if NATO, is putting that much money and effort into military spending, then, what does this do to Russia's threat perception? Being the declared enemy. So the arms race is up, but there's and I mean, in Europe we are used to arms races. We had an arms race during the Cold War, but even in those days, in the 1980s, when there was a huge peace movement, when U.S. Middle range rockets were installed in Germany, the Pershing II rockets. But those days, there was a two-pronged strategy. It was deterrence and talk, and and the talk element is totally missing now. I don't see it.
There needs to be so much more
And
diplomacy and social contacts and education, and all of these factors are being just totally put aside. And, as you said very rightly, you cannot look at Russia as a European and say the threat is zero, right? I mean, they have proven time and time again in the last 2 decades that they're willing to violate the fundamental tenet of international law, which is borders are sacred. You do not invade another sovereign country unless it's in self-defense, and they've done it over and over again. So the fear, I fully understand it, is that they will do it yet again when the time is right, and so on and so forth. So, the fear is not all that unreasonable, but at the same time, guess what, Russia? Guess what, Europe? Neither Europe nor Russia are going anywhere. You are stuck where you are. There's not going to never be a Russia. There's not never going to be a Europe. You have to get along. So let's begin the party instead. Let's have a good time with each other and have more exchanges, more interaction again, hang out with each other, do whatever you want to do, drink vodka, smoke pot, whatever you want to do. But for goodness sakes, guys, let's just get along for once. I mean, it's ridiculous. The similarities between the European and the Russian cultures are immense. And the history is so common and so shared, and it makes no sense economically, socially, politically, militarily, you name it, to keep fighting and be at loggerheads with each other. So new voices need to come out and really kind of, re-establish contacts and make them better than ever before.
And you mentioned before that everybody seems to have forgotten what happens when an arms race is going on. And I think you do have a point there, because like in the 1980s, and the ruling class, or the politicians came from a generation that had witnessed the horrors of war, the horrors of the Second World War. And it really imprinted on them, it really imprinted on them the wish that, you have to you have to make sure this is never going to happen again. No more wars. And I'm afraid that the politicians that are running the show right now, they haven't gone through this experience, and maybe they lack imagination or whatever, but they seem to they seem to think that this can be won, not realizing that in war, everybody always loses.
Always, and you always go back to the starting place, at the end of the war again. Okay, great. There's a war. Millions of people die. Trillions of dollars of damage is done. Finally, people get tired and there's no more treasure to pay for the war. So the war ends, as they always do, in some way, shape, or form. I mean, it's just a matter of how bad it is and how long it is, but they always end. And then what? You rebuild, and then you promise not to do it again. And then you do the whole, process over and over again. Let's just all of us stand back and look at the situation and say, guys, let's forget nothing about the past, remember everything about the past, and move forward in an evolved, greatly advanced way in which we can actually build cooperation and collaboration and realize that any quest for empire is bound to fail. So why even start it in the first place? And I'm talking about all countries in the world, the dying empires of the world today, the aspiring empires, the wannabe empires, the burning embers of the once great empires that now try to come back and never can. Come on. Why do we need to have this constant quest, absurd thing of empire? We're the dominant ones. We're going to tell everybody else what to do. We're the greatest. We're the most awesome. Yeah, blah, 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 blah. Just be earthlings, for goodness sakes. Just be humans. And with that type of collaboration, in a spirit of equality, we can really get somewhere. And we can really collaborate and cooperate with each other and build something like the world has never seen before, instead of just repeating again and again the ridiculous and absurd, practices of highly unevolved, highly unenlightened humans that somehow have this propensity to kill somebody because of the language they speak or the religion that they, believe in.
Now, talking about war, in our last episode, we talked at length about, Israel's attack on Iran. And so just to follow up a little bit, then, the US then also joined the fight, and in their operation called Midnight Hammer, they for the very first time used these bunker busting bombs, 30,000-pound monsters. And now the debate is going on, how far, back is the Iranian nuclear program? What's going to happen next? And I think there's a couple of interesting things there. One thing is that the US side is trying to convince, or at least Donald Trump is trying to convince his audience, that this was a major success, and nobody really knows. That's the thing, nobody really knows, and so nobody also knows what the Iranians are going to do. There were these 400 kilograms of uranium already enriched to 60%. They had ample time to hide it somewhere else, as well as probably, some centrifuges to enrich it even further to 90%, which is, the enrichment that you need to build nuclear devices. So nobody knows that, and we are probably not going to know what's going to happen, because now Iran has always said, no, we don't want to build a bomb. We don't think it's a good idea. It would create a nuclear arms race in the region, and if we had a nuclear bomb, then it would probably provoke other nuclear powers to use nuclear bombs against us, and so on and so forth. So now they rather adopt, some, ambiguity. They keep their cards so that we don't read them. They probably don't let the IAEA inspect anymore. Partly, actually, also because they suspect the IAEA to have collaborated with the secret services of the US and Israel, when it comes to identifying targets and identifying nuclear scientists and so on and so forth. So I don't know how credible that is.
You know what I would propose is I can't remember the name of it. I think it's the Treaty of Tlatelolco or something like that. But the famous treaty signed by all the Latin American countries to make Latin America a nuclear-free zone. And other discussions have been in place in all of the many regions to have, nuclear-free zone treaties set up. So let's have negotiations to create a nuclear-free zone Middle East. And that would mean, one country alone would refuse to participate in those discussions, and that is clearly Israel, the country that clearly has nuclear weapons, that has never publicly admitted it, but every single intelligence agency in the world has said and confirmed that they do have at least 70 warheads and probably many more. So, I mean, what would you do if your mortal enemy had a weapon that could decimate your entire country? Would you just go, oh yeah, whatever? It's not like that. Like, so let's have that, and let's then, build from that and go further and get reason back into the picture, get collaboration back into the picture, get an understanding that the only reason this conflict between Israel and all these other countries and the Palestinians keeps continuing on and on and on and on and on is because of what Israel is attempting to achieve. It has nothing to do with the religion. It has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It has nothing to do with any of that stuff. It has to do with their quest to create not only what they call these days a greater Israel, but much more, predominantly during the last 80 years, the complete and total decimation of the wishes and the self-determination rights of the Palestinian people who were there when the state of Israel was founded. I mean, it's as simple as that. And I speak as a non-Arab, as a non-Jew, as a non-Christian, just as a human being who happens to believe in international human rights law. And I have been there and I have seen it with my own eyes, and the brutality is beyond description. So it's not just some, obscure thing to me. I have seen it very up close. And the time again has come in this conflict to try the impossible, which is not impossible. I still continue to believe, which is a peaceful coexistence between all the people in that region, forming a one-state solution approach, which is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society, just like anywhere else in Europe, largely secular in nature, democratic, social democracy, rule of law based, no discrimination against any group whatsoever, and then move forward and see where things go. Because right now it's clearly a dead end. There's an absolute dead end happening. And as we talked about last time, there's a new book. I can't recall, unfortunately, I think it's Peter Beinart is the author. But it was something to the effect of being Jewish after Gaza, something to that effect. I haven't read it yet. I just saw the title. I heard a friend of mine, a Jewish friend, talk about it in glowing terms, like, really, you should read it. But that sentiment is also completely forgotten again here. It's not just what is done to you that makes horrible things happen in life. It's what you do to others. And that doesn't simply go away. That can't be. Cognitive dissonance can only help you so far, and we again need voices from the outside, independent observers who care about every human, who care about all human suffering, who care about misery and don't want it to happen to anybody anywhere, to insert themselves into the discussion and end this madness that's happening there. Nobody likes it, And it has to somehow, this impasse of 60, 80, 100 people being killed every single day, like just taking pot shots at the people. And, Haaretz newspaper has published these horrible accounts that orders were given, to soldiers to just randomly shoot people with no sort of physical danger being displayed. And the list goes on and on and on and on and on. And just as a brief aside, another thing too, with all this militarism, coming back, all of these arms races, all of this military production everywhere, who are the actual people that produce these weapons? Do you ever think of it? on the assembly line, when you're putting these parts together, when you're putting the trigger into the bomb, when you're pouring the gunpowder in, when you're pulling the bomb parts out of a molding machine, when you're finally packaging it to be sent to some other country in the world, does it never cross your mind that this is going to be used to kill, in what all likelihood is going to be an innocent civilian? I mean, does that never cross your mind? Do you go home and eat dinner and just go, "Oh, I had a great day at work, honey. We produced 17 bombs today. It was awesome." You know, consider it. Consider that as the person, the individual worker that's producing these weapons. It's not just for your own self-defense. It's not the justifiable production of a weapon to defend your country or your people. The vast majority of these weapons are going to be used outside of your borders from where they're produced and purchased from. And I hope that more people realize this and consider that there are other options which are a lot more pro-life in orientation, because I think about it every time. I have been to and worked in so many war zones and seen the impacts. 1 year later, 5 years later, 25 years later, 50 years later, that old man who no longer has a leg because it was blown off by American B-2 bombers flying over Vietnam in an undeclared war against a so-called enemy that they had nothing to do with, is sitting there right now on the street of Saigon begging for food. That's what the consequence is of these weapons. So, they go on and on and on, and I can go on and on this topic, but it's really getting out of control, and we need a lot more people to demand disarmament, to really try to push for reason to prevail again.
Couldn't agree more. And that's the disturbing thing here is that as a German, the German government gives full backing, even shipping, arms and itself to Israel, or allowing the shipment of arms, and defending also the attack on Iran, which is clearly a violation of international law. So that there's a major discussion here, which I think is really interesting, about like the role of international law. Europe and Germans, Germany was fundamental in setting up the International Criminal Court and so on and so forth. And now, there's some, but law, it's the moment you start to, the essence of law is to treat everybody as equal. And now, but now the thing is, there's some, relativization happening. Here, you have to look at this aspect and that aspect, and and once you start doing that, then the fundamentals of the law are broken, and everybody is like cherry picking, and so that in German newspapers you can see the question is like, international law, is it a thing only for the feuilleton? Something that you talk about at dinner parties or whatever, or in elite circles, sometimes sipping coffee or champagne or whatever, but it needs to be a hard, it needs to be a compass to guide politics. And
well, it's I'm an international human rights lawyer, so I obviously totally believe in it and I know all about it. But I think one of the really useful arguments that can be made is, everybody says no one complies with international law. There's no enforcement mechanism, right? You hear it constantly, not just now, but forever, right? The bottom line is 99% of international laws are complied with all the time because it's in the interest of the state to do so. So every airplane you see in the sky is subject to international law. You know, the entire ocean is subject to international law. You know, obviously conflicts are subject to international and so on and so forth. And yes, now they are being eroded and not taken seriously enough. But still, the vast majority of the time, international laws that governments take, obligations that governments freely take on themselves, are in fact complied with. If you look at the compliance level of decisions by the European Court on Human Rights, for instance, which is an international law body, it's overwhelming the number that are fully and completely complied with. Same with the European Court of Justice, the Court of the European Union in Luxembourg, and the list goes on. So, you know, it's 80 years since the UN Charter was founded. It's a, you know, really important period of time and debate about the efficacy of this field. But when you have the most powerful country in the world, at least for the moment, not for long probably, the United States, which was the driving force behind the UN Charter, the UN, and all sorts of subsequent treaties that built the body of international law, starting in 1983, saying to the world, we're going to lose a case at the International Court of Justice filed against us by Nicaragua because we were illegally mining their harbors and trying to destroy the popular government at the time in Nicaragua. We know we're going to lose the case, so one day before, we're going to say we no longer accept the compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. Just like that. Oh, well, if we're going to lose, we're not going to trust the court, so of course we're going to renounce it. And since that time, 1983, the United States' role in the field of international law has gone down, 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 down. So that's, what is that, 42 years. To the point now where they would essentially laugh at you if you mentioned international law as a reason to do something or not to do something. They have such disregard for instance, the International Criminal Court, that they're issuing laws.
They even threaten. They threaten, you know, staff and judges at the International Criminal Court with sanctions. You know,
absolutely.
If they don't follow, you know, if they don't follow orders from Washington, you know.
So basically, what they're saying to the world, you know, and this is a very deep, multifaceted series of attacks against the International Criminal Court. And so when you don't ratify the Rome Statute from 1998, which, you know, guides the work of the International Criminal Court, what you are effectively saying, you might have all sorts of legal arguments and this and that and say, oh, we're afraid our soldiers might be threatened with arrest because of behavior in some far off battlefield. That's may or may not be true. But what essentially you're saying is, we don't care what international criminal law says. If we have national interest to do something that involves the use of force or the decimation of a village or the carrying out of crimes against humanity or war crimes, screw you, we're going to do it. And there's nothing you can do to touch us. That is, at its core, what the total denial of the ICC is. No matter what they say, no matter how they try to, you know, make it all glossy and fine and that it's all oppressive against them. No, that's basically what they're attempting to say. Nobody tells us what to do. We don't have to comply. And, you know, that attitude also comes back to haunt you. When countries throughout history have had that attitude, it does not usually play out very well. And it's starting already in the United States, just in terms of people who are refusing to travel there. Like in some cases, it's apparently 90% of reduction in tourist arrivals in certain airports. I mean, people are refusing to invest there. People are selling U.S. dollars at a record rate. The U.S. dollar is totally crashing like it hasn't for like 40 or 50 years. The list goes on. The price is already being paid, and the reputation decline of the United States is staggering. You know, I even feel it myself with an American accent, even though I am not American anymore. I even feel it myself in Australia. You know, people look at me differently now than they used to, you know, and I am a good vibe to everybody, so it's no problem. But I hear it also anecdotally across the world. People say, can I actually travel still as an American? You know, so why would you do that? You know, why would you consciously try to make yourself hated by growing portions of the planet? It does not make sense to me. And when you add tariff threats on top of that, all sorts of sanction regimes on top of that, and the mass expulsion of migrants on top of that, it's not really forming a very positive foundation for the reputation of that country.
The reputation of the US, has really gone down a lot. Speaking for myself, when, in my youth, like, when I grew up in the 1960s, I had the most positive picture of the US that you could possibly have. The land of the free, the land of opportunity, the land where, with hard work, and effort and, bright ideas, you could make it to the top, from dishwasher to, millionaire, billionaire, and so on and so forth. And, a land, that was, rich and, the lands that brought us blue jeans and rock and roll and, huge pop festivals like, I don't know, Woodstock and, and all that hippie vibe. And, but now the image, basically the US had, it was not just a military power, it was a soft, its soft power, was unrivaled, And I think the soft power has declined dramatically.
Yeah, and you don't get that back, very quickly. When that goes, it takes a long time to build it back. A long, long, and when trust is gone, you don't just build it back tomorrow, And so let's hope that it's the end of a certain phase of history and that, the new America that eventually rises will again rejoin the international community, will shake hands as equals and partners, and will together, build a planet that everybody can be proud of.
But that's, that would, for that to happen, the US would have to shed, this idea of American exceptionality, of being the indispensable nation, of, and as this exceptionality, showing in ways that it feels it is above the law, sort of, thereby creating all these double standards that nowadays are, they just, blatant, they jump in your eyes, kind of, it's impossible to overlook.
They don't even try anymore, to cover up their double standards. They just do it. We hope very much you enjoyed that episode. Send us your ideas, your comments. Keep them coming. We love receiving all of your different points of view, and we will endeavor to reply to at least some of them in the coming weeks, months, and years. If you have any ideas for future episodes that you'd like to propose, please feel free to do so. Our goal really is to build up a global network of people that can see value in the idea of world citizenship, can see value in the idea that a unified world is going to yield far better results than one based upon differences. We hope you'll join us in this quest, and we look forward again to seeing you tomorrow with the next episode of Democracy Tomorrow.